For thousands of years, the Ojibwe people of Lake Superior have followed a rule that outsiders rarely understood. Before crossing certain waters, they stopped, and they left an offering. Tobacco, usually, sometimes more. The offering was not for the lake itself, it was for something said to live beneath it. The Anishinaabe called it Mishipeshu, the Great Lynx, a being described as part cat, part serpent, with horns of pure copper, dwelling in the deepest parts of the largest freshwater lake on Earth. And according to traditions preserved for countless generations, Mishipeshu had one responsibility above all others. It guarded the copper. Then, in the 1840s, thousands of American miners arrived on Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula, chasing the richest native copper deposits ever found. As they blasted their shafts into the hills, they began breaking through into something no one expected. Mines that were already there. Ancient pits, thousands of them, dug by hands no one could identify, still holding the stone hammers of whoever had worked them, resting exactly where they had been set down thousands of years earlier. Whoever those first miners were, they had taken enormous quantities of copper out of this land. And then, one day, they stopped. They left their tools in the pits, as if they intended to return the next morning. They never did. The new miners laughed at the old warnings at first, but the records they left behind suggest that many of them did not laugh for long. Today we're examining the historical documents, the Ojibwe oral traditions, and the archaeological evidence surrounding one of North America's oldest unsolved mysteries. Who mined the copper of Lake Superior thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt were raised? Why did they abandon the richest copper ground on the continent? And why did the people who lived here insist, for generation after generation, that something beneath the water was still watching over it? Was the guardian of the copper just a story, or was it the memory of something real? To understand what the Ojibwe said was guarding the copper, you have to travel to the eastern shore of Lake Superior, to a place called Agawa Rock. There, on a sheer granite cliff face rising straight out of the water, generations of Anishinaabe painted images in red ochre. The paintings are still visible today, protected inside a Canadian provincial park. And the largest, most striking figure among them is not a man, a moose, or a canoe. It is Mishipeshu. The image shows a creature with the body of a great cat, horns curving from its head like a bull's, and a ridge of spines running down its back to a long coiled tail. The horns matter. In Anishinaabe tradition, horns are a sign of spiritual power, and Mishipeshu's horns were said to be made of solid copper. The creature did not simply live near the copper. In a very real sense, it was the copper. According to the traditions recorded from Ojibwe elders in the 19th and 20th centuries, copper belonged to Mishipeshu and to the underwater spirits it commanded. Small pieces could be taken, but only in the proper way. A person took copper with an offering, with tobacco with respect, and only as much as was needed. Copper, handled this way, was powerful medicine. Families kept small pieces wrapped in cloth, passed down as treasured protectors, but copper, taken wrongly, taken greedily, taken without asking, was another matter entirely. The traditions are consistent about what followed. Storms rose out of calm water. Canoes were swallowed. Men died, not always immediately, but reliably. The lake collected its debt. There was even a rule about speech. On the open water, you did not say the creature's name. Travelers crossing Superior spoke of it, if at all, in whispers, because to name it on its own, water, was to call it. To this day, some Anishinaabe communities leave tobacco on the shoreline before a crossing. For centuries, outsiders filed all of this under superstition, a colourful legend from a people who happened to live beside a dangerous lake. But here is the detail that should give anyone pause. the Ojibwe were not describing an imaginary treasure. The copper was real. It is among the purest native copper on the planet, and it lies exactly where the traditions said it lay, on the Keweenaw Peninsula, and on the island the Ojibwe called Minong, the place we now call Ile Royale. Modern geology confirmed what the traditions already knew, which raises an uncomfortable question. If they were right about the copper, what exactly were they remembering when they talked about the Guardian? Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through historical records, archaeology, and indigenous traditions, consider subscribing. It helps the channel and allows me to keep researching stories like this one, because the earliest written records we have from this region, set down by Europeans who travelled the lake in the 1600s, do not describe the copper legend as a quaint local belief. They describe people who were genuinely deeply afraid. And one of those records tells of 4 men who tested the rule and what it cost them. The first Europeans to write about Lake Superior's copper were French missionaries and traders in the 17th century. Their reports, sent back to France and published in the collection known as the Jesuit Relations, are among the oldest written documents about the interior of North America. In 1667, the missionary Claude Allouez reported that the native peoples of the lake held copper in extraordinary reverence. He wrote that pieces of it were kept wrapped like sacred objects among the most treasured possessions of a family, and that they were preserved with a care the French found difficult to understand. A few years later, around 1670, the missionary Claude Dablon recorded something far stranger. He described an island in the lake, an island rich with copper that the local people refused to approach, and he wrote down the story they told to explain why. According to the account, 4 men had once landed on the island to cook a meal during their crossing. They found copper lying loose on the ground, beautiful pieces heavy in the hand. They gathered what they could carry and pushed their canoe back into the water. Before they had gone far, a voice rolled out across the lake behind them, demanding to know who was stealing from the children of the deep. The men paddled for their lives, and then, one by one, over the course of the journey home, they died. The last of the 4 survived only long enough to reach shore and tell what had happened. Then he died too. That story was not collected by a folklorist in the 20th century. It was written down by a French missionary more than 350 years ago from people who treated it not as a fable, but as a warning. A century later, the warning was still holding. In the 1760s, the British fur trader Alexander Henry heard of an enormous boulder of pure copper resting on the banks of the Ontonagon River, a stone the Ojibwe regarded as sacred, from which offerings were made, and small pieces respectfully taken. Henry organized one of the first European attempts to mine the region. The venture ended in failure when his mine shaft collapsed. The lake country, it seemed, was not ready to be opened. It stayed that way until 1841, when Michigan state geologist Douglas Houghton published a report confirming what the traditions and the traders had long claimed. The copper was there, in almost unbelievable purity and quantity. Within 2 years, the rush began. Thousands of miners poured into the Keweenaw. And that is when the discoveries started. All across the copper range, the new shafts kept striking old ones. Pits dug into solid rock, filled with centuries of leaf litter and soil, with mature trees growing out of them. Inside, the miners found stone hammers, not by the dozen but by the cartload. Some individual pits held so many abandoned hammerstones that the miners simply shoveled them aside as rubble. Then, in 1848, at the Minesota Mine near the Ontonagon River, a mining agent named Samuel Knapp followed a depression in the ground into an ancient working and found something that made newspapers across the country. Deep in the old pit sat a single mass of native copper weighing roughly 6 tons. It had been mined free of the rock by the ancient workers and then raised, propped up on a crib of oak timbers, the wood still preserved beneath it after all that time. The surface of the great mass was smooth, pounded clean, where pieces had been hammered away. Think about what that object represents. Someone, in a time so distant that entire forests had grown and died above the pit, had freed a 6-ton block of metal, lifted it and worked it, with nothing but stone, wood and fire. And then, with the block still sitting on its cribbing, still full of usable copper, they walked away and never came back. The miners had a phrase for these unknown predecessors. They called them the ancient miners. And the question the miners asked in the 1840s is the same question archaeologists ask today. Who were they? And why did they leave? The scientific investigation of the ancient pits took more than a century to mature, and what it eventually revealed made the mystery deeper, not shallower. Radiocarbon dating of wood and organic material from the old workings, along with dated copper artifacts across the region, pushed the origins of the mining back further than almost anyone had expected. The oldest evidence of copper working around Lake Superior is now dated to roughly 8,000 years ago, with some researchers arguing for dates earlier still. Archaeologists call this tradition the Old Copper Complex, and it stands among the oldest metalworking traditions anywhere on Earth. The scale is just as remarkable. Surveys have documented thousands of ancient pits along the Quinault Peninsula and across Isle Royale. How much copper was actually removed is still argued over. Popular writers have claimed staggering figures, hundreds of millions of pounds, while archaeologists defend far more modest numbers. But even the cautious estimates describe an organized, sustained mining operation carried out across millennia by people with no metal tools, no draft animals, and no written records. And Lake Superior copper traveled. Artifacts hammered from this distinctive metal have been found across eastern North America, in burial mounds and settlement sites hundreds and even thousands of miles from the lake. Whoever controlled the copper country stood at the head of one of the oldest trade networks on the continent. Then comes the part that archaeology has never fully explained. Around 3,000 years ago, the intensive mining stopped, not gradually in the way an exhausted resource winds down. The richest deposits were far from empty. The miners of the 1840s proved that. Rather, the archaeological record shows copper simply fading out of everyday use. A people who had made heavy copper axes, spear points, chisels, and knives for thousands of years drifted back to stone tools, while copper was reserved more and more for ornaments, for beads and rings and ceremonial objects. Some archaeologists explain this as economics, arguing that well-made stone was simply cheaper than mined metal. Others see a cultural transformation, copper shifting from the toolkit to the sacred. The honest answer is that it remains an open question. Whole cultures rarely walk away from a superior material. Here, the record says one did. And there is one more chapter, and it is the one the textbooks spend the least time on. Remember the sacred boulder on the Ontonagon River, the copper stone that Alexander Henry failed to reach. In 1843, a Detroit merchant named Julius Eldred bought the boulder, first from an Ojibwe leader, then a second time from squatters who claimed it, and hauled it out of the wilderness with block and tackle over a portage road cut by hand. Before he could profit from exhibiting it, the federal government seized the stone. The Ontonagon Boulder, nearly 2 tons of native copper, was shipped to Washington and eventually placed in the collections of the Smithsonian Institution. For the Ojibwe communities of the region, the boulder was not a mineral specimen. It was a sacred being that had been taken. In the 1990s, the Quinault Bay Indian community formally petitioned for its return under the federal law that governs the repatriation of native sacred objects. The Smithsonian reviewed the claim and denied it, ruling that the boulder did not meet the legal definition of a sacred object. The boulder remains in the Smithsonian's custody to this day. It is not on public display. The single most storied piece of copper in American history, an object of documented reverence for centuries, sits in a facility the public does not see. The institution's position is a legal one and it is on the record, but it is difficult to miss the shape of the larger story. The traditions said the copper was guarded and should not be taken. The copper was taken anyway, and the most sacred piece of it now lies where no one can visit it at all. So we are left with two accounts of the same country, told thousands of years apart. The Ojibwe account says the copper belongs to something beneath the lake, that it can be taken only with respect, and that those who take it greedily are punished by storms and by drowning. The historical account says an unknown people mined this copper for 5,000 years and then abandoned it, leaving their tools in the pits. It says the first written records from the region describe men dying after taking copper from a forbidden island, and it says the modern industry that ignored the warnings was born rich, but also born unlucky. The waters around the copper country became one of the deadliest stretches of fresh water in the world, a graveyard of hundreds of ships, many of them carrying ore. The old sailors of Superior had their own saying that the lake never gives up those it takes. Even the miners themselves, many of them Cornishmen from the old tin mines of England, arrived with their own belief in spirits underground, the knockers whose warnings a wise man did not mock. None of this proves that anything lives beneath Lake Superior. It has never been the purpose of this documentary to claim that it does, but consider what the tradition of Mishipeshu actually accomplished, whatever its origin. It encoded, in a form that survived for millennia, a set of true statements: that the copper was there, that it was immensely valuable, that taking it carelessly cost lives, and that the lake itself was capable of killing anyone who treated it lightly. Every one of those statements is a fact. The question is whether the Guardian was a way of remembering those facts, or whether the facts were evidence of the Guardian. Perhaps the tradition preserves the memory of the ancient miners themselves, a memory of why they stopped. Perhaps it was a way of protecting a sacred resource from exhaustion, or perhaps the Anishinaabe, who knew this water longer and better than anyone, were describing something in the lake that they understood, and we do not. The pits are still there, on Isle Royale, silent under the moss, inside a national park, where removing so much as a pebble is now once again forbidden. The paintings are still on the rock at Agawa, the horned creature still facing the water. And the boulder is still in a warehouse in Washington. The copper, wherever it rests, is still being guarded. The only thing that has changed is who guards it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through historical records, archaeology, and indigenous traditions, consider subscribing for more investigations like this. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the ancient miners of Lake Superior stopped because of economics, or because of something they encountered? And should the Ontonagon Boulder be returned? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.